Camp Hearn, Texas. Summer 1943. The transport train lurched to a stop, and through the narrow ventilation slats, Corporal Franz Weber caught his first glimpse of America's endless sky, heat rippling off flat earth, and something he didn't expect: laughter. American guards were joking with each other, smoking cigarettes, completely at ease. Franz had been prepared for brutality. The regime's propaganda officers had shown them photographs, told them stories about American savagery, prepared them to die rather than surrender. But standing on that platform, watching a guard offer water to prisoners stumbling off the train, Franz felt the first crack in everything he'd been taught to believe. North Africa, May 1943. The desert sun had turned the sand into something that burned through boot leather, and Franz Weber crouched behind what remained of a supply truck, his rifle empty, his canteen dry for 2 days. Around him, the remnants of his company waited for the inevitable. They'd been cut off 3 days earlier during the retreat from Tunisia, and now the American tanks were closing in, their engines growling across the dunes like mechanical thunder. Lieutenant Hans Becker, 24 years old, university educated, his uniform caked with dust and dried blood, called out the order to surrender. His voice cracked on the words, and Franz saw shame flash across his face before resignation settled in its place. They raised their hands, emerging from cover like ghosts, and waited for whatever came next. The Americans arrived in jeeps and half-tracks, weapons ready but not firing. A captain stepped forward, sunglasses reflecting the brutal sky, and said something in English that none of them understood. But his tone wasn't cruel. It was almost bored, professional, as if capturing enemy soldiers was routine paperwork rather than the dramatic moment Franz had been preparing for since basic training. They were searched, efficiently but not roughly. Their personal effects were catalogued letters from home, photographs, a harmonica that belonged to Private Kurt Schneider, who'd been dead for a week, but whose possessions they'd been carrying anyway. An American medic moved among them, checking wounds, offering water from canteens that seemed impossibly clean. Franz drank and felt tears prick his eyes at the simple relief of it. That night, they were held in a temporary camp, tents and barbed wire hastily erected in the desert. Franz lay on sand that was still warm from the day's heat and stared at stars that looked the same as stars over Germany, but felt foreign somehow, displaced. Lieutenant Becker whispered to him in the darkness, "Do you think they'll shoot us?" Franz didn't answer because he didn't know, and the not knowing was worse than certainty would have been. But morning came, and with it breakfast, actual food, not the field rations they'd been surviving on for months. Coffee, bread, something that might have been eggs. The Americans ate the same meals, Franz noticed, sitting nearby, talking and laughing as if the war was happening somewhere else entirely. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. These were supposed to be the enemy, yet they seemed like ordinary men doing an unpleasant job with as much grace as they could manage. The voyage across the Atlantic took 17 days. Franz and 2,000 other German prisoners were packed into the hold of a converted cargo ship, conditions cramped but not inhumane. They received 2 meals daily, were allowed on deck for fresh air, and were guarded by soldiers who seemed more concerned with preventing escape than inflicting punishment. Franz befriended a man named Otto Richter during the crossing, a farmer from Bavaria who'd been conscripted in 1940 and had spent 3 years wishing he was back home with his pigs, and his wife and his 2 daughters, who he prayed nightly, were still alive. Otto was 42, old for a soldier, with hands scarred from farm work and a laugh that came easier than it should have given their circumstances. They talked for hours, crammed in the hold with hundreds of others, sharing stories that had nothing to do with war. Otto described his farm, the way morning fog settled in the valley, how his oldest daughter could make bread that tasted like sunshine. Franz talked about his apprenticeship as a carpenter in Stuttgart about plans to open his own shop someday, about a girl named Greta, who Dee promised to wait for him, though he'd given her no reason to keep that promise after 3 years of silence. At night, the ship rolled on swells that made men sick, and Franz would lie awake listening to the ocean and wondering what waited for them in America. The propaganda had been vivid: torture, starvation, casual violence, but the voyage itself contradicted those stories. When prisoners got seasick, medics treated them. When fights broke out over cramped conditions, guards separated the combatants without excessive force. It was confusing, this contradiction between what they'd been told and what they were experiencing. Lieutenant Becker, sharing the same corner of the hold, confided one evening that he feared re-education camps, psychological torture designed to break their minds and remake them. Franz thought about that, about whether his mind needed breaking, about what he believed anymore beyond wanting to survive and eventually go home. The certainties he'd carried into war had been eroding for months, ground down by reality's friction, and now even the certainty of American cruelty was proving unreliable. They arrived in New York Harbor on a morning shrouded in fog, and through the mist, the Statue of Liberty emerged like something from a dream. Otto stood beside Franz at the rail, staring at it, and said quietly, "She's welcoming us." The irony wasn't lost on either of them, prisoners of war, greeted by a symbol of freedom. Enemies finding strange mercy at the doorstep of a nation they'd been taught to despise. The train journey to Texas took 4 days, crossing a continent so vast it made Germany seem like a garden plot. Franz pressed his face to the window gaps, watching America unfold, cities that hadn't been bombed, farms that looked prosperous, civilians who waved, sometimes at the passing train, without apparent fear or hatred. The cognitive dissonance deepened with every mile. Camp Hearn sat on flat Texas grassland, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, but otherwise looking almost ordinary. Rows of wooden barracks painted white, a mess hall, recreation areas, all laid out with military precision. As Franz and the others were processed through intake, an American sergeant explained the rules in broken German, aided by a translator. Work details, mail privileges, camp currency for purchasing extras. The word that kept appearing was Geneva Convention, said with a seriousness that suggested it actually meant something here. The barracks were plain but clean, with bunks, thin mattresses, and lockers for personal belongings. Franz claimed a lower bunk near a window and lay down, feeling the exhaustion of weeks of travel settle into his bones. Around him, other prisoners moved with the same uncertain wariness, men waiting for the trap to spring, for the promised cruelty to finally reveal itself. It didn't come. That first evening, they were fed in the mess hall beef stew, bread, coffee, portions that were almost generous. Franz ate slowly, waiting for his stomach to rebel against food richer than anything he'd had in months, but his body accepted it gratefully. Otto sat across from him, tears running down his weathered face. And when Franz asked what was wrong, Otto just shook his head and said, "I thought I'd never eat real food again." The guards maintained professional distance, but weren't actively hostile. They carried rifles and enforced rules, but they also made jokes, offered cigarettes sometimes, treated the prisoners less like captured enemies and more like unwanted responsibilities to be managed efficiently. Franz kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the hidden cruelty to emerge. But days passed, and it remained hidden if it existed at all. Lieutenant Becker organized the prisoners in their barracks into something resembling military order, partly from habit, partly to maintain structure in captivity's disorienting freedom. They made their bunks with precision, kept the barracks clean, stood for roll call with discipline that surprised some of the American guards. One guard, a kid from Oklahoma named Thompson, told Franz through gestures and simple words, "You guys are more organized than some of our own troops." By the second week, prisoners were being assigned to work details. The Geneva Convention allowed it, required it even, as long as the work wasn't directly supporting the war effort. Franz found himself on a farm crew, transported daily to local ranches and cotton fields, where American manpower had been depleted by military service. The first morning, they arrived at a ranch owned by a man named Jim Callahan, a sun-weathered Texan in his 60s who looked at the German prisoners with something between curiosity and resignation. He needed hands to mend fences, feed livestock, harvest crops that couldn't wait for American boys to come home from overseas. The irony was obvious to everyone: German prisoners filling gaps created by Germans fighting American soldiers. Callahan worked alongside them that first day, demonstrating what needed doing, communicating through gestures and simple commands. Franz, trained as a carpenter, found himself repairing fence posts, working wood with borrowed tools, falling into rhythms that felt almost normal. The Texas heat was suffocating, worse than North Africa somehow, but the work was satisfying in a way combat had never been: building instead of destroying, creating something useful instead of something lethal. At midday, Callahan's wife brought lunch to the field: sandwiches, cold lemonade, slices of apple pie that tasted like heaven. She handed food to German prisoners with the same matter-of-fact courtesy she'd show any workers, and Franz realized she probably thought about them less than he thought about the situation's strangeness. To her, they were just hired help, nationality irrelevant to the day's tasks. Otto worked nearby, his farmer's expertise making him valuable immediately. He examined Callahan's irrigation system and suggested improvements, drawing diagrams in the dirt, gesturing explanations until Callahan understood and nodded appreciation. By week's end, Otto was essentially managing the farm operations, and Callahan was paying him in camp scrip and homemade bread his wife sent along. The work created an unexpected bridge. Language barriers prevented deep conversation, but shared labor built something that words might have complicated. Franz learned that Callahan's son was serving in the Pacific, that his daughter had married a soldier who died at Normandy. That loss and worry crossed national boundaries without needing translation. He didn't say these things directly. Franz pieced them together from overheard conversations, from photographs in the Fairmouse kitchen from the way. Callahan's wife sometimes watched the German prisoners with an expression that mixed grief and relief that at least these young men were alive and safe. The real transformation happened gradually, through accumulated small moments rather than dramatic revelations. Franz had been raised on stories about American decadence and cruelty, about a nation of mongrels without culture or honor. But Camp Hearn told a different story through details the regime's propaganda officers couldn't have anticipated. The camp library was stocked with German books, newspapers, even music. Prisoners could check out Goethe and Thomas Mann, could read letters from home that arrived with surprising regularity, could write responses with reasonable confidence they'd be delivered. Franz wrote to Greta, carefully avoiding military information, describing Texas in terms that made it sound almost pleasant. He didn't know if she'd respond, or even if she was still alive, but the ability to try felt like humanity persisting, despite war's best efforts to erase it. Lieutenant Becker organized educational classes, teaching English to prisoners who wanted to learn, holding discussions about literature and history. The guards didn't interfere. One guard, a corporal named Martinez, who spoke some German, sometimes sat in on the English lessons, helping with pronunciation, making jokes that crossed language barriers through shared laughter. Franz watched Becker struggle with this. The man had been an officer in the German army and fought American soldiers, and now he was learning their language from their guards in a prison camp that felt less like punishment and more like surreal peacetime service. The camp had a canteen where prisoners could use their labor scrip to purchase extras: candy bars, cigarettes, toiletries, small luxuries that made captivity bearable. Franz bought a Hershey's chocolate bar one day and ate it slowly, savoring sweetness he hadn't tasted in years. Kurt Schneider's harmonica had been returned to his effects, and Franz claimed teaching himself to play during evening hours. The music drifting across the compound as other prisoners wrote letters or played cards or simply sat watching Texas sunsets that painted the sky in colors that had nothing to do with war. Sports became another unexpected bridge. The Americans organized baseball games, prisoners versus guards, matches played with genuine competitive spirit, but also genuine camaraderie. Franz didn't understand the rules initially, but Otto picked them up quickly, his farm boy reflexes making him a natural hitter. They lost most games, but occasionally they won, and when they did, even some of the American guards congratulated them with sincere enthusiasm that transcended the prisoner-guard dynamic. Church services were offered, Catholic and Protestant, conducted by chaplains who treated German prisoners as souls needing ministry rather than enemies deserving condemnation. Franz attended sometimes, sitting in wooden pews in the camp chapel, listening to sermons in English he barely understood, but finding comfort in familiar rituals. One Sunday, the chaplain spoke about forgiveness, and even through the language barrier, Franz felt the weight of those words, pressing against something in his chest that he'd been avoiding examining too closely. Franz received Greta's response in late September, 4 months after he'd mailed his first letter. The envelope was battered, stamps from 3 different postal services, but the paper inside was intact. Her handwriting brought tears to his eyes before he even read the words. She was alive. Stuttgart had been bombed heavily, but she'd survived in a basement shelter with her mother and younger brother. Their apartment was gone, but they'd found housing with relatives outside the city. Food was scarce, morale was worse, but she was managing. And yes, she was still waiting, still hoping, still loving him despite 3 years and a war and an ocean between them. Franz read that letter a dozen times, memorizing every word, every curve of her handwriting. He showed it to Otto, who read it and clapped him on the shoulder with genuine happiness. That night, lying in his bunk while other prisoners snored or whispered or lay awake with their own thoughts, Franz tried to reconcile the reality around him with the reality Greta described. She was starving while he ate beef stew. She was hiding from bombs while he played baseball. She was in danger while he was safe. The guilt was enormous, crushing, impossible to process. He was a prisoner of war, but his captivity was more comfortable than her freedom. The cognitive dissonance had been building for months, and Greta's letter brought it to crisis point. Franz had wanted to serve his country, had believed in duty and honor, and all the words that sounded noble when shouted at rallies or printed in newspapers. But confronted with the evidence of American mercy and German suffering, those certainties crumbled like buildings under bombardment. Lieutenant Becker found him sitting outside the barracks at dawn, still holding Greta's letter, and sat down beside him without speaking. They watched the sun rise over Texas' 2 German soldiers in an American prison camp, wrestling with loyalty to a regime that had lied to them and gratitude to enemies who were treating them with more humanity than their own leadership had shown. Finally, Becker said, they told us America was decadent, that democracy made them weak. But I think perhaps it makes them strong in ways we weren't taught to recognize. Franz didn't respond, but he kept that observation close, turned it over in his mind like a puzzle piece that might explain everything if he could just figure out where it fit. December 1943 brought cold weather, Texas-style chilly mornings and evenings with warm afternoons. Nothing like German winters, but enough to remind them of home. The camp administration announced that prisoners could celebrate Christmas, could decorate barracks, could receive special meals and packages from the Red Cross. The announcement was met with disbelief that slowly transformed into tentative joy. Franz and Otto worked with others to create decorations from whatever materials they could scrounge paper stars, carved wooden ornaments, makeshift evergreen branches from camp vegetation. The barracks transformed slowly into something that resembled celebration, and prisoners who'd been numb with displacement began to show emotion again, dangerous and painful, but also healing. The camp chaplain organized a Christmas Eve service, combining prisoners and guards in the chapel, German and English hymns alternating, voices blending in, Silent Night, sung in two languages that shared the song's origins. Franz stood in that chapel, singing words he'd learned as a child, surrounded by American guards who were also singing, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. These weren't monsters. They were just men, same as him, caught in war's machinery, doing their best to maintain humanity despite everything pushing toward brutality. The Christmas meal was extraordinary roast turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pie for dessert, portions generous enough that some prisoners couldn't finish. The mess hall buzzed with conversation, laughter, even a sense of community that transcended the barbed wire and guard towers. Jim Callahan had sent a box of his wife's cookies, addressed to the German boys who fixed my fences. And Franz ate one slowly, tasting butter and sugar and kindness baked together. That evening, as prisoners gathered in barracks exchanging small gifts they'd made or traded for carved figurines, sketched portraits, repaired personal items, Lieutenant Becker stood and said, "I want us to remember this Christmas. Not because the war is over, but because we learned something here about what kind of peace might be possible." His voice broke slightly on the words, and several men looked away, unwilling to show tears, but unable to prevent them. Franz wrote to Greta that night, describing the Christmas celebration, trying to explain the confusion of feeling grateful to be a prisoner while knowing she was suffering in a war zone. The letter took 3 attempts, each draft crumpled and discarded as inadequate, before he finally settled on simple honesty. "I am safe here. I am treated well. And every day I am more ashamed that you are not." By spring 1944, Camp Hearn had developed its own rhythm, a strange hybrid of military discipline and civilian normalcy. Prisoners worked, studied, played sports, maintained correspondence with home when possible. Some enrolled in correspondence courses through American universities, studying subjects that had nothing to do with war, agriculture, engineering, literature. The camp administration encouraged education, seeing it as both good policy and good propaganda. Franz was learning English steadily now. Helped by Corporal Martinez and by American newspapers, the prisoners were allowed to read. Through these newspapers, they learned about the war's progression. Italy invaded, Rome liberated, D-Day launched in June. Each Allied victory was simultaneously good news for their captors and terrible news for their homeland. The emotional whiplash was constant, disorienting, impossible to resolve cleanly. The work details continued. Franz became a regular at the Callahan Ranch, his carpentry skills making him valuable for everything from barn repairs to furniture fixing. He'd progressed from simple labor to skilled craftsman status, and Callahan treated him accordingly, with respect that didn't quite feel earned, but wasn't exactly undeserved either. The old rancher would sit sometimes during breaks, drinking lemonade his wife brought, and talk about Texas history, about droughts and cattle drives and oil boom stories that had nothing to do with war, but everything to do with life persisting regardless. Otto had become something of a camp celebrity, his farming expertise making him essential to agricultural work details. Local farmers requested him specifically, and the camp administration accommodated these requests because productive prisoners were easier to manage than idle ones. Otto accepted his celebrity with the same humble competence he brought to everything, writing letters home describing Texas agriculture with genuine enthusiasm, as if comparing farming techniques between Bavaria and Texas was the most natural thing for a prisoner of war to do. But beneath the surface normalcy, deeper questions stirred. Prisoners debated in barracks after lights out, voices low, topics dangerous. What would happen when the war ended? Would they be sent home to rubble? Would there even be a home to return to? What did they owe a regime that had lied to them, that had sent them to die for causes increasingly revealed as hollow? What did they owe themselves, their families, truth? Lieutenant Becker led many of these discussions, his university education making him a natural philosopher, though he claimed no special wisdom. He'd been reading American newspapers religiously, parsing English with improving fluency, and what he found disturbed him. Reports of persecution, of forced labor camps, of systematic cruelties that made German propaganda about American savagery look like projection. He shared these reports carefully, knowing they were dangerous, knowing some prisoners would reject them as enemy lies, knowing some would accept them and be devastated by acceptance. Franz listened to these discussions with growing unease. Part of him wanted to dismiss the reports as propaganda. Every nation lied about enemies in wartime. But another part, the part that had been eroded by months of American mercy, suspected the reports were true. That suspicion felt like betrayal, but rejecting it felt like willful blindness. He was trapped between loyalty to everything he'd been taught and evidence accumulating against those teachings. May 1945 brought news that Europe had surrendered. The war was over. German forces defeated, the regime collapsed. Everything they'd fought for reduced to ashes in memory. The announcement reached Camp Hearn on a morning when the Texas heat was already building, and prisoners received the news in stunned silence. Franz sat on his bunk, letter from Greta in his hands she'd written 2 weeks earlier, describing starvation conditions, Russian troops approaching, fear so palpable her handwriting shook. And now the war was over, and he had no idea if she'd survived the ending. Around him, other prisoners reacted differently, some weeping, some angry, some simply numb, emotion too enormous to process. The camp guards treated them carefully that day, understanding that defeat created dangerous instability. But there was no cruelty in their caution, just professional awareness of a situation requiring delicacy. The mess hall served regular meals. Work details continued. Life persisted, because stopping would have been worse than continuing, and everyone understood that instinctively. That evening, Lieutenant Becker gathered prisoners in the barracks and said, "The war is over. We lost, and now we must decide who we want to be in peace. Some men won't forgive the Americans for defeating us, but I think perhaps we should be grateful they defeated us humanely." His words hung in the stifling air, dangerous and true, and no one contradicted him, though some looked away, unwilling to accept yet unable to deny. Jim Callahan came to camp the next day, seeking Otto and Franz specifically. He'd brought his wife, and together they invited the two Germans to the ranch for dinner. A proper dinner, not work detail food. The camp administration approved reluctantly, unprecedented but not prohibited, and Franz found himself sitting at a civilian table for the first time in 3 years, eating pot roast and listening to Callahan talk about rebuilding. "The world needs rebuilding," Callahan said in slow English Franz could mostly follow. "You boys have skills, knowledge. When you go home, you'll need to rebuild your country, same as we rebuilt ours after our own civil war." Otto translated the parts Franz missed, and together they absorbed the strange message that enemies could become builders, that defeat didn't have to mean eternal humiliation, that perhaps mercy during war could enable peace after. Franz thought about that during the long truck ride back to camp, watching Texas landscape blur past in evening light. He'd been defeated but not destroyed, imprisoned but not tortured, captured by enemies who treated him with more dignity than his own regime had shown its citizens. The cognitive dissonance had finally resolved into something like understanding. Strength wasn't always brutality, and mercy wasn't always weakness. Summer 1945 stretched into fall as bureaucracy determined when and how prisoners would be repatriated. Europe was chaos, cities destroyed, populations displaced, infrastructure collapsed. The Americans couldn't just dump prisoners back into that chaos, so they waited, maintained camps, continued work programs, tried to prepare prisoners for a homeland that no longer resembled the countries they'd left. Franz received confirmation in August that Greta had survived. Her letter was brief, written on scraps, but she was alive, living with relatives in a village that had escaped major damage. She asked when he'd come home, and he had no answer because no one did. Repatriation was happening gradually, prioritized by health and skills and bureaucratic factors no prisoner fully understood. The camp administration began offering classes on democratic governance, on rebuilding techniques, on agricultural modernization attempts to prepare prisoners to be productive citizens in whatever came next. Attendance was voluntary, and cynics mocked the classes as indoctrination. But Franz attended, hungry for knowledge that might help him survive peace as successfully as he'd survived war. Lieutenant Becker taught some of these classes, translating American materials into German, discussing civic responsibility and democratic principles with the seriousness of someone who'd seen firsthand what happened when citizens abdicated those responsibilities. He'd become something of a camp leader, respected by prisoners and guards alike, his intellectual rigor making him valuable to administrators trying to facilitate productive repatriation. Otto continued working for Callahan, who'd petitioned to keep him longer, needing his expertise for harvest season. The request was approved, and Otto spent those months teaching Callahan's grandsons modern farming techniques, creating a strange legacy where German agricultural knowledge improved Texas ranching. He wrote home describing this, and his wife responded with bewildered gratitude that at least her husband was useful and safe while the world rebuilt itself. Franz's repatriation orders arrived in February 1946, nearly a year after the war's end. He would travel by train to the East Coast, then by ship to Bremen, then by whatever transportation existed to Stuttgart. The journey would take weeks, maybe months. A Germany waiting for him would be unrecognizable, occupied, devastated, struggling. His last day at Camp Hearn felt surreal. He packed the few possessions he'd accumulated: letters from Greta, carved wooden, figurines he'd made during idle hours, the harmonica that had belonged to Kurt Schneider, a photograph of himself with Otto and Corporal Martinez that someone had taken during a baseball game. Everything fit in a small duffel, his entire American captivity compressed into objects light enough to carry. Jim Callahan came to say goodbye, bringing his wife, shaking hands with Germanic formality that made Franz smile despite everything. The old rancher handed him an envelope containing an address, saying through Otto's translation, "If you ever come back to Texas, you've got a place to stay." Franz accepted it, knowing he'd never return, but touched beyond words that the offer existed. Lieutenant Becker organized a farewell gathering in the barracks. Prisoners who remained, toasting those departing with coffee and ersatz cake, singing German songs that felt both nostalgic and painful. Becker gave a short speech about remembering mercy, about carrying forward the lessons they'd learned, about building peace with the same dedication they'd once brought to war. His voice caught on the final words, and Franz understood that Becker was staying longer. His leadership skills made him valuable to repatriation efforts, so his release was delayed indefinitely. Otto walked with Franz to the transport trucks, two men who'd become brothers through shared captivity, knowing they'd probably never meet again. They embraced, German formality abandoned in the emotion of parting, and Otto said simply, "Remember this kindness. Pass it forward." Franz promised, though he didn't know how or when or if circumstances would ever allow it. The truck convoy rolled out of Camp Hearn on a morning when fog hung low over Texas grassland, obscuring distances, making everything feel temporary and uncertain. Franz looked back through the rear canvas, watching the camp disappear, and felt something complicated that wasn't quite gratitude, wasn't quite grief, but contained elements of both. He'd been a prisoner here for 28 months, and those months had unmade certainties he'd carried into war and rebuilt them into something different, more complicated, more true. Franz reached Stuttgart in April 1946, traveling through a Germany that looked like the end of the world. Cities reduced to rubble, population starving, infrastructure non-existent, hope scarce as coal. He found Greta living in 2 rooms of a bombed-out building, sharing space with 4 other families, surviving on rations that made Camp Hearn meals seem like feasts. Their reunion was tender. An awkward 3 years had changed them both in ways difficult to explain. But she held him while he cried, and he held her while she told him about bombings and starvation and losses too numerous to catalog. That night, lying together on a mattress that was mostly springs, Franz told her about Texas, about American guards who treated him humanely, about work on a ranch owned by an old cowboy who'd shaken his hand goodbye, about mercy that had sustained him while she suffered. Greta listened without judgment, her fingers tracing scars on his hands carpenter, scars from prison labor that had been productive rather than punitive. When he finished, she said, "Perhaps that's how we rebuild, by remembering that enemies can become humans again once the fighting stops." Franz held her tighter and hoped she was right, though evidence around them suggested rebuilding would be harder than surviving had been. He found work as a carpenter, his skills valuable in a city desperate for reconstruction. The irony wasn't lost on him. He learned some of these techniques repairing American ranch buildings while Germany was being bombed into rubble. But his hands remembered what they'd been taught, and gradually, board by board, he helped rebuild. Otto wrote occasionally, letters that took months to arrive. He'd been released in late 1946, returned to Bavaria to find his farm intact, but his wife aged by war's hardships. His daughters had survived, married men who'd also survived, and his grandchildren were being born into a Germany that barely resembled the country their grandfathers had fought for. Otto wrote about teaching them farming techniques he'd learned in Texas, about how knowledge crossed borders more easily than armies did, about hope persisting despite everything suggesting hopelessness. Lieutenant Becker's letters were more philosophical, written in English Franz now read fluently. Becker had stayed in America, found work teaching German at a university, married an American woman he'd met during repatriation processing. He wrote about guilt and grief, about trying to reconcile who he'd been with who he wanted to become, about mercy received and mercy trying to give forward. His letters asked questions more than answered them, but Franz treasured them as evidence that thinking deeply about difficult things was worthwhile, even when conclusions remained elusive. Years passed. Stuttgart rebuilt slowly. Democracy established itself tentatively, and Franz lived a life that was ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously. He married Greta, raised 2 children, taught them carpentry alongside values learned in a Texas prison camp, that mercy was possible even between enemies, that humanity could survive inhumanity's attempts to erase it, that small kindnesses accumulated into bridges spanning chasms war had excavated. His son asked him once, "Were the Americans cruel to you?" Franz thought carefully before answering, wanting to be honest, wanting to be fair. "They were just," he finally said. "They followed rules even when rules were difficult. They treated us as humans, even when we'd been taught to treat others as less. That justice, that basic human recognition, it saved something in me that war had almost destroyed." The wooden figurines he'd carved in Camp Hearn sat on shelves in his workshop, reminders of time when his hands had needed occupation to prevent his mind from breaking. His children played with them, unaware they were artifacts from a prison that had felt less like punishment and more like strange sanctuary. The harmonica still worked, and Franz played it sometimes in evenings, melodies drifting through Stuttgart's rebuilt streets, carrying memories of Texas sunsets and baseball games and mercy that had seemed incomprehensible until experienced. In 1973, Franz received an invitation. Jim Callahan's grandson, managing the ranch now, had found the old address list, discovered that Franz was still alive, invited him to visit Texas and see what his carpentry work had endured. Franz declined initially too expensive, too distant, too many memories. But Greta insisted, so they traveled together, an elderly couple visiting the site of Franz's captivity 30 years after war's end. Camp Hearn was gone, its barracks demolished, its land returned to agriculture. But the Callahan Ranch remained, and Franz walked through buildings he'd repaired decades earlier, his carpentry still solid, still functional. Callahan's grandson showed him fences he'd mended, furniture he'd built, work that had outlasted war and occupation and time itself. That evening, sitting on the ranch porch watching Texas sunset paint the sky the same colors he remembered, Franz tried to explain to Callahan's grandson what Camp Hearn had meant. How captivity had been liberation from ideology, how imprisonment had freed him from propagandist chains, how enemies had shown him humanity his own side had been systematically destroying. The young man listened politely, but didn't quite understand, couldn't understand without experiencing the specific inversion Franz had lived through. But he said, "Grandpa always spoke highly of you German boys. Said you worked hard, learned fast, appreciated things most folks took for granted." Franz accepted that assessment, knowing it was true but incomplete, knowing the full truth was too complex for casual conversation. Franz Weber died in 1987, peacefully, surrounded by family. His last words in German, but his last thoughts possibly in intense English, that language he de-learned from enemies who became something more complicated than friendship, but deeper than casual acquaintance. His obituary mentioned his service in the war, his time as a prisoner, his work rebuilding Stuttgart, but couldn't capture the essential strangeness of his experience. That he'd been treated mercifully by enemies, while his own regime treated its citizens brutally. That he'd found humanity in captivity and lost it in freedom. That the war had unmade him, and an American prison camp had remade him into something better than he'd been before. These paradoxes didn't fit obituary formulas, couldn't be reduced to dates and accomplishments, existed in memory's complicated terrain where certainty dissolved into questions without clean answers. Otto Richter lived until 1991, dying on his Bavarian farm, his last harvest brought in by grandchildren who'd never known war but carried forward knowledge he'd learned in Texas. Lieutenant Hans Becker died in America in 1995, a university professor emeritus, his papers donated to archives studying POW experiences, his testimony preserved for historians trying to understand how mercy could exist amid brutality. The Camp Hearn site became a historical marker in 2006, a small plaque noting that German prisoners had been held there during World War II, mentioning nothing about the mercy shown, or the transformations enabled, or the complicated legacies of treating enemies with dignity. Visitors stop sometimes, read the sparse text, take photographs, move on without understanding what happened in those barracks, on those work details, during those years when America demonstrated that strength could coexist with compassion. But the legacy persists in ways unmeasured by monuments. In carpentry techniques passed from German prisoners to Texas ranchers. In farming methods that crossed oceans and improved harvests. In children raised by men who'd learned that enemies could become humans again, that propaganda could be dissolved by direct experience, that mercy received could be mercy given forward. Franz's wooden figurines still exist, scattered among grandchildren and great-grandchildren who know they're important but not exactly why. The harmonica rusted decades ago, finally giving up after years of service. The letters between prisoners and families were mostly lost, though some survive in archives, studied by scholars trying to understand moral complexity in simple stories. What remains, most importantly, is the question Camp Hearn posed and never fully answered. What happens when you treat enemies with mercy? Do you weaken yourself through softness, as propaganda insists? Or do you demonstrate strength through restraint, proving that civilization can survive even war's attempts to destroy it? Franz Weber and 2,000 other German prisoners learned the answer through experience rather than theory. They learned that mercy wasn't weakness, but perhaps the truest form of strength requiring more discipline than cruelty, more courage than vengeance, more wisdom than hatred. They learned it in Texas camps under impossible sky, in work details alongside former enemies, in small kindnesses that accumulated into transformations nobody could have predicted or planned. And that learning, that knowledge purchased through the strange currency of humane captivity, became their contribution to peace. Not dramatic or headline-worthy, just the quiet insistence that enemies remain human. That dignity transcends nationality, that compassion costs less than brutality and pays longer dividends. Camp Hearn closed in 1945, its purpose fulfilled, its prisoners released, its buildings gradually reclaimed by Texas grassland. But its lessons persist wherever former prisoners carried them to Germany's reconstruction, to America's self-understanding, to children raised with values learned in captivity, to anyone willing to consider that treating enemies well might be more subversive than treating them cruelly. The sky over Texas remains vast and indifferent, burning blue from horizon to horizon, same as it was in 1943 when Franz first saw it through train car slats. But under that sky, on land that once held barbed wire and guard towers, something important happened, something worth remembering, something that suggests humanity's capacity for mercy might be deeper and more durable than hatred as capacity for destruction. Franz Weber couldn't have articulated that on his arrival day, exhausted and afraid and expecting brutality. But decades later, holding Greta's hand on a ranch porch, watching the same sunset he'd watched as a prisoner, he understood. Mercy received had become mercy given, kindness experienced had become kindness shared, and the small acts of human dignity shown by American guards to German prisoners had multiplied across decades into something that might, optimistically, be called hope.